In Year 12 ATAR English, you will be expected to be able to write comparatively. So this video is just going to run over the practice and the theory of writing comparative essays. So just before we start, I want to get into the definitions because the different ATAR subjects annoyingly have slightly different definitions. So whereas in the HASS subjects like history, compare means one thing and contrast means another, in English, compare means to examine the similarities and differences. So if you see the word compare, just know that you can contrast as well. The other word you'll see pop up in this video and in your exams is the word evaluate. And to evaluate essentially means to judge the effectiveness of a particular author, particular text, particular technique, etc. So why write comparatively? First and foremost, comparative questions will make up a third of the questions in the essay section of the exam. On top of that, comparing and evaluating are seen as higher order skills by the markers, so you're probably more likely to get a really high mark if you choose one of the comparison questions. Lastly, it's a required skill. About half of the exams in the last few years have asked a comparative question in section 1 of the exam, so you have to write comparatively sometimes. I've included here a few lines from the syllabus that show that in Year 12, one thing that separates it from Year 11 is that students are expected to compare and evaluate texts. So the first step when you're thinking about writing a comparative essay is to come up with the thematic links between texts. The texts you're comparing must have a center point. They must have a thing that connects them, that makes them worth writing about. We have had in the past some really fantastic analytical essays comparing a novel to a film whose ideas and genres were completely separate, so the comparisons became a bit pointless despite the fact the analysis was top-notch. Your links should be thematic, so you should try and find a similar or contrasting idea or purpose or subject between your texts. Now these can be conceptual, so you might get a question that asks you to compare how two texts use conventions of a particular genre for different purposes, but still these should be linked with a shared idea. So the analogy I'm going to use as a running theme throughout this video, if you haven't noticed already, is the idea of apples and oranges. It's common to compare apples and oranges because despite their distinctly different tastes, they're both fruit. It would be pointless to compare an apple to, say, a brick because they have such different purposes.
And now you can make a decision. Do you want an apple or do you want an orange? That's democracy.
I also like bananas.
Exactly. Good.
I'm going to run over a few essay structures now because often what students find challenging when writing comparatively is how best to structure their essay. So the first thing I'm going to say is to be flexible because there's no mandated way to do this and it really changes depending on your ideas, so you have to do what works for you. As far as introductions and conclusions go, your conclusion is going to remain the same and your introduction will essentially be the same except you'll include an extra text summary. So some of the options. The first option I'm going to discuss quickly is one that was suggested in the Good Answer book, and that's to have just 2 big body paragraphs in your essay where you discuss both texts in each body paragraph. So each body paragraph will focus on its own point of comparison between the 2 texts, and you'll analyze both texts, and it'll essentially be really dense, but really analytical. This structure is not encouraged, only because in the past we've had students run into a lot of issues, especially when it comes time to replicating these in exam conditions. The big paragraphs get really messy and really confusing. And interestingly, last year, the markers report on the 2018 exam said that of concern this year were the number of responses with only 2 body paragraphs, often lengthy yet without showing an understanding of paragraph structure. 2 body paragraphs for a 4-page essay was inappropriate structure, and that many candidates need to employ transitional devices and paragraph breaks more effectively. So let's look at a few ways you can do this. The second option is just to split those 2 big body paragraphs into 4 smaller condensed paragraphs, hopefully for more clarity. So each body paragraph would focus on one particular text, but the second and fourth paragraph would focus on the opposite text. So body paragraphs 1 and 2 would be the first point of comparison between the 2 texts, and body paragraph 3 and 4 would be the second point of comparison. In this structure, body paragraphs 1 and 3 would sort of set up the comparison, and therefore body paragraphs 2 and 4 must contain comparative sentences that connect the text, and I'll get into that in more detail later. This would be a good way of showing the markers that you're employing transitional devices and paragraph breaks more effectively, so could work. And if you did it, it would essentially look like this: an introduction with 2 text summaries, body paragraphs 1 and 2, where in body paragraph you have analysis of text 1, and then in body paragraph you compare that text with the second text and compare the ideas between the two. Then you would just rinse and repeat. So in body paragraph 3, you'd set up a new point of analysis and comparison, and then compare it with the second text in body paragraph 4, then have your conclusion. The third option is what we call a sustained comparative essay. And this is where each body paragraph flows into the next. There's continual comparisons and comparative analysis, and for that reason, every essay will have a sort of central theme or idea that runs through the entire essay. Each body paragraph after the first must contain comparative sentences that connect the texts, and we say that this is probably the most impressive because you have a really nicely flowing essay by the time you finish, and it can just be 3 body paragraphs long, which will save you some time as well. Sometimes students choose to write about 3 texts.
I also like bananas.
Look, you can do this, just know that it can be tough. For example, trying to balance 3 text summaries in the introduction can get a bit dicey, but as always, just find what works for you. I've spoken a few times now about the necessity of having comparative sentences in your paragraphs. A better word would probably be transitional sentences, which are basically complex sentences which compare multiple clauses. And because they're complex sentences and they are tough to execute, these can really impress the marker. Essentially, they transition from one text to the other. And at first, we find that a lot of students struggle with this, but it is a skill, and the more you practice it, the better you'll get. So the first thing you want to do is to become familiar with these transitional terms, which are used to link one clause to another. And as you can see, there are a heap of them. From there, you'll want to use these transitional terms to construct your own complex comparative sentences. I've got some examples here where I've just said text 1 and text 2 and left the meat and bones blank. I'll let you fill in those blanks yourselves with your own texts and your own ideas. But just to read a couple out, I could say that both texts explore notions of gender. However, while Slaughterhouse 5 has a sexist portrayal of femininity, Inglourious Basterds instead empowers women. Or you could say, in a different fashion, Jasper Jones explores racism through the eyes and voice of a young boy. I will let you read these in your own time, so you can just pause this video and maybe try your hand at a couple with your own text. But here are a bunch of complex comparative sentences that you can use. Now, obviously, even if you're writing comparatively, you still have to hit the question. The marking rubric doesn't change just because the question is comparative, and comparing alone isn't enough. So no matter what you choose to write about, and no matter what text you choose to compare, remember that the question is the focus. Now, your teachers have been kind enough to provide some past examples. I'm not going to read these out again, but if you do want to pause and take particular notice of how those transitional devices are used to compare 2 texts within the same sentence. We've got a variety of questions here, from genre to voice to perspective, but notice how also not all of the texts actually ask for comparison. Sometimes, even if the question is about one text, you can still bring in a second text, and through your comparisons you can have a deeper analysis, which can be really impressive. If we're focusing on structure and we're aiming for cohesion, then you have to think about where these transitional sentences belong in your paragraphs. First and foremost, if it's a comparative paragraph, then I would mention both texts in your topic sentences, but also remember that you have to really clearly outline the direction that paragraph's going in that topic sentence, so make sure it's not muddled. A really good opportunity to link to the previous text is after your evidence and analysis, and then again in your linking sentences. You should probably have at least 2 or 3 comparative complex sentences per body paragraph, unless it's a setup body paragraph like your first one. It's not really essential then. So now it's your turn. Study your secondary texts, which your teachers are going to be giving you throughout the next few weeks. Start making some thematic connections between them. Have a think about why your teachers chose these texts, and then start linking them to the different syllabus concepts so that no matter what type of question you get, you could respond to it. And then start writing. So, have fun and good luck.